Great. Well, I hope the conference so far has been going really, really well. And I'm glad that I was able to participate in this way through Zoom. So I've got a bit of a presentation, and then we'll have time for questions. But as you can see from the title of my presentation, basically what I'm going to be talking about so far is the triumph of drug war politics over science when it comes to Ibogaine research, at least so far. However, I think the most important point to make is that the FDA is not part of this drug war politics problem. We do have problems with the National Institute on Drug Abuse, with the DEA, with the Office of National Drug Control Policy, but the FDA is putting science over politics. And we've seen that to be the case for MDMA research, which I'll go into just a little bit later, and also for marijuana research. And I believe that the FDA would do the same for Ibogaine research, that really it would be based on science over politics. So I think that may also be the case in other countries, in other regulatory agencies. So if there were the resources to put into developing Ibogaine through the FDA system or through the European Medicines Agency, I believe that we would be able to develop Ibogaine into a legally approved prescription medicine. And I think that's really the main point I'd like to leave you with throughout this entire talk, that at this moment, that the FDA is really putting science over politics. I see the same with the European Medicines Agency. And I think that's reasons for hope, because there is such a crisis in the treatment of addiction. And Ibogaine is one of the more fruitful areas of research to go forward with. So to whatever extent that we can mobilize resources and scientific efforts to go through the regulatory system, I think that that should be a top priority for those people interested in Ibogaine. Now, we know that Ibogaine is not illegal in most places of the world, so that it's not absolutely necessary to go through regulatory agencies to set up Ibogaine clinics. And so you might be wondering, well, why go to all that expense? I'm currently roughly guessing it'll be about $25 million to do that. And I think one of the main reasons to do that is both to understand more about Ibogaine, to legitimize its use, but also once a drug has gone through the FDA, it's very possible that insurance companies will cover the treatments. And so right now we have a situation where Ibogaine is legal in many and most countries of the world, but patients are having to pay for the treatment themselves. And so from an overall social perspective, there's people that can afford to pay for it and there's people that can't. And so by going through the regulatory system and obtaining approval as a prescription medicine, then it democratizes access to Ibogaine for people that otherwise could not afford it. So I think it's also the case that in those countries where Ibogaine is illegal, like the United States, if we were able to go through the regulatory system, that would change the legal context as well. So I think there's multiple reasons to try to raise the resources, but it's an awful lot of money. But again, the main message is, as far as I can tell, the regulatory doors are open. The deaths from Ibogaine that have taken place, I believe, can be prevented when it's conducted in a medicalized setting. And so I think the risk-benefit ratio, there's a very strong chance that it could be demonstrated to the satisfaction of regulatory agencies and then transformed into a legal prescription medicine that insurance companies pay for. But that's not the story I'm going to be telling you right now. Let me... So here's just a quote from Albert Einstein. It has become appallingly obvious that our technology has exceeded our humanity. And this same concept really is what's motivated me to focus my life's work on psychedelics and on trying to bring them back both scientifically and culturally, to mainstream the use of psychedelics in legal contexts in our culture. And it applies to Ibogaine as well. This idea that our intellectual capacities, our cognitive abilities have been so well developed over the last centuries, many centuries, millenniums, but that our emotional and spiritual potential has lagged behind. And therefore, we face a world where we're destroying the environment, destroying the climate, massive species extinction, and we have technologies of destruction and war that are of an incredible magnitude, but we don't yet have the emotional and spiritual capacity to deal appropriately with our technology. And so while I believe that our technology, properly applied, could solve the problems that we face with resource allocation, we could have enough food, enough water, enough shelter, enough resources for everybody. Sorry. We don't equitably distribute the resources, and we also have murderous wars that are endangering the whole humanity. So I think this imperative to develop our humanity, that tools, the psychedelic tools, including Ibogaine, have that capacity. And so therefore, I think we really need to think about the work that you're doing at this conference, the work that people are doing all over the world, trying to bring Ibogaine into more widespread use and acceptance, both, at least initially, primarily for the treatment of addiction, but also for personal growth, for spirituality. It's some of the most important work that's being done in the world right now. Right now, there are a whole series of studies all over the world that are looking at psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. And these studies are taking place not just in the United States, but in many, many countries of the world. And so it's true to say that we are now in the midst of a renaissance in psychedelic research, and that renaissance has more or less taken 50 years from the 60s to recover from the backlash to the psychedelic revolution in the 60s in the United States, mostly in England and elsewhere. And so we have compelling studies with ketamine for depression. People are saying that ketamine is the most important neuroscience discovery over the last several decades in terms of the treatment of depression. And so that's opened up people's eyes a lot. There's research in Brazil with ayahuasca for depression that's showing it to be quite effective. And there's research going to be taking place in the United States and in England, phase 3 drug development research with psilocybin for depression. We've also got studies have taken place in Switzerland, the US, England, elsewhere with psilocybin, MDMA, and LSD for end-of-life distress, anxiety and depression related to the fear of death. We have research in the United States with MDMA for PTSD that's also taking place in Switzerland, Canada, and Israel. And there's been research, not so much research, but observational research, you could say, with various people going to South America for trying to use ayahuasca for PTSD. We've completed studies with MDMA for social anxiety at UCLA that were quite successful, and there's been fairly preliminary research with psilocybin for obsessive compulsive disorder. And in substance abuse, there's been research with Ibogaine, mostly observational research for substance abuse, also ayahuasca, psilocybin, MDMA, and in the past, there's been research with LSD as well for substance abuse. So the role of psychedelics in the treatment of substance abuse is well known. Historically, the Native American Church in the United States uses peyote, which has mescaline, for the treatment of substance abuse. So I think this tradition of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy for substance abuse is not only well established. I should have added ketamine also to that for substance abuse, because there was research in Russia for ketamine for heroin addiction and alcoholism before the Russians shut it down. So the context of global renaissance in research in psychedelic assisted psychotherapy is supporting and has been inspired by the work with Ibogaine in the treatment of substance abuse. As I opened up by talking about how the regulatory agencies are now really an open door when it comes to MDMA research, and I think the same would be true for Ibogaine research. There's been pretty much widespread publicity in the Washington Post, CNN, Science Magazine, even Breitbart.com about a recent decision from the FDA. It's taken us 31 years to get there. So I started MAPS in 1986, but FDA, August 16th, granted what's called breakthrough therapy designation for MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD. And this was breakthrough therapy designation is like the gold star, the gold ring of what programs FDA offers for those people that are trying to develop a drug into a medicine. So the most promising drugs that the FDA identifies through preliminary evidence that pharmaceutical companies, sponsors like MAPS, nonprofit sponsors like MAPS, submit to the FDA, that they select those that are the most promising, they award them breakthrough therapy designation, and then they provide special incentives, special meetings with the FDA, special oversight, and expedited timelines to try to make these drugs into medicines in a more rapid manner, because they're considered for serious or life-threatening illnesses for whom there's a large patient population that are not adequately treated by the currently available medications and treatments. And so it was a little bit astonishing to me. I knew that MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD qualified for breakthrough therapy, but it's such a public demonstration of support from FDA that I wasn't sure if they were willing to do that in such a public way. And the FDA really came through and did so on August 16th. And we had previously, on July 28th, gotten another remarkable outcome from the FDA, in that we had been working for 6 months in what's called a special protocol assessment process, which is once the FDA says you can go to phase 3 being the pivotal trials that are necessary to prove safety and efficacy in order to approve the drug as a legal prescription medicine. We'd been a 6-month special protocol assessment process where we negotiate with FDA every aspect of the phase 3 design, including even the formula for the statistical analysis plan, where the FDA discovered in this super lengthy formula that we had changed, made a mistake, and one negative sign should have been a positive sign, or a positive sign should have been a negative sign. I don't remember which way it was. But on July 28th, we got an agreement letter in the special protocol assessment process. And that means that once you have this agreement letter, if you do those studies using that design and you generate research proving safety and efficacy, then the FDA will approve the drug. The only caveat is that if you identify any new safety problems, then the FDA has to take that into account. But with tens of millions of people have already taken MDMA or ecstasy or Molly or whatever in uncontrolled circumstances over the last 30 years, we have an enormous body of evidence about the safety profile of MDMA, more so than any drug that's ever been approved by the FDA. And similarly, not nearly to that extent, because Ibogaine is not a drug that's being used as a drug of abuse because it's such a challenging experience. But still, there's been a lot of experience with Ibogaine in Ibogaine clinics for the last 30 years plus. So I think it's very unlikely that new safety issues will arise in these phase 3 trials with MDMA, nor do I think new safety issues would arise in the trials with Ibogaine. So this is basically, in my sense, persuasive evidence that the regulatory doors at FDA and European Medicine Agency are open, and that this pathway is a pathway that makes sense if the resources can be developed. So I'd just like to share now, moving a bit more into Ibogaine specifically, that in 1985, this is a picture of me and Leo Zeff. Leo Zeff is known as the Secret Chief, the leader of the underground psychedelic psychotherapy movement. And he's the one that really helped with Claudio Naranjo bring Ibogaine to the United States and share information with Howard Lotsof and others about it. And so I was fortunate in 1985, when we were initially suing the DEA to try to protect the therapeutic use of MDMA, that Leo suggested that it would be important for me to have some deep personal experiences to sort of integrate my own shadow, so that when I was working suing the DEA, that I wouldn't be projecting all my negativity out onto them, and I would find ways to work with them in a more efficient way. And so he first off worked with me with LSD harmaline combination, and then months after that he suggested that we move to Ibogaine. And so it actually was the Iboga route, and since he said it takes a while to take effect, he decided to simultaneously administer LSD and Ibogaine. And so this was one of the most profound experiences of my life. I found it to be exceptionally difficult. It took days and days to recover from. But it was, in a sense, I had had a repetitive pattern that many of us have, this self-criticism, this link between self-criticism and self-hatred. And I saw how the drive for perfection, the drive for quality can be linked in a harmful, negative way with self-perfectionism, and then self-criticism linking to self-hatred. And so I just ended up being nauseated and vomiting and struggling through that. And ever since then, I've had a more gentle approach to the self-critical part of my mind. And I should add that I could feel the LSD come on and several hours and peak, and work through that fairly well. And then I could feel as another kind of consciousness, the Ibogaine experience coming. So this was the only experience I've had of Ibogaine in my life, but I look back on it as one of the key psychedelic psychotherapy experiences. And so I understand the value of Ibogaine and Iboga for personal growth, and even for these repetitive patterns. I felt it cleared out a lot of chatter in my mind and freed me to have more mental space to look out. So I have a great appreciation for all the work that you're doing to try to bring it into more public settings and to use Ibogaine for the treatment of addiction and personal growth. So Howard, as you all know, I had my experience in 85. Also in 85, Howard patented Ibogaine as the rapid method for interrupting the narcotic addiction syndrome. And in 1986, Howard, formed NDA International and also got a use patent on Ibogaine for treating drug and alcohol addiction. In 1986 is when I started MAPS. And so we had two different approaches at that time. One was nonprofit drug development, which is what I felt I wanted to do with MAPS. And the other was for-profit drug development. And so since MDMA had been used widely in underground settings, and MDA had been used in therapy in the 60s, and Richard Jensen had done a study, a PhD dissertation on therapeutic use of MDA that he published in 72. The uses of MDMA for therapy were not novel, were not patentable, were in the public domain. Whereas the use of Ibogaine for addiction was not something, particularly narcotic addiction syndrome, was not something that was widely known or in the public domain. So Howard was able to develop a patent, and then he decided to work on a for-profit basis. I think for both of us at the time, there was an enormous resistance at the FDA, at regulatory agencies, and FDA was blocking all psychedelic research. So I think the appeal that we had for either donors or investors was very difficult, was too difficult, because no research was really possible at this time. And so Howard's approach was to begin underground trials in the Netherlands in 1990, where they could do that in above, in a way without worrying so much about legal problems. And so I mostly then just worked on trying to submit protocols to the FDA, that all of which were rejected. So from 84 to 90, Ibogaine advocacy groups unsuccessfully petitioned NIDA to fund Ibogaine research to treat opiate addiction. And NIDA, again, National Institute on Drug Abuse, was pretty much committed to looking at the risks of these drugs, exaggerating the risks, and then denying whatever benefits they were, and not really funding any research into beneficial uses. But through the work of Howard Lotsof and others, in what was a rather astonishing situation, they were able to persuade NIDA's Medications Development Division to start looking into Ibogaine-related preclinical animal research. So from 91 to 95, that was really remarkable. What happened in 1992 was that the FDA, the group at the FDA that evaluated medical use of Schedule I drugs shifted. A new group took over, and they decided to put science over politics. And they had an advisory committee meeting to focus on our MAPS' project to try to do MDMA research for cancer patients with anxiety. In 1990, this group had approved Rick Strassman to do DMT research. So that was the first psychedelic research in multiple decades. And so in 92, NIDA had a meeting, a 2-day meeting with their preclinical scientists to talk about whether they thought human research should be resumed. And that took place the 2 days before the FDA meeting. And the decision of the NIDA animal researchers was that human research should be initiated, that their animal research was becoming increasingly irrelevant, because unless you can correlate animal studies with human studies, it's unclear what the meaning is of the animal data. And so they felt that several decades of the suppression of human research with psychedelics was making their animal research uninterpretable and unclear what it really meant. So we had NIDA animal scientists, preclinical animal research people saying, yes, go ahead and start human research. And then the FDA advisory committee in 92 formally said, yes, we will resume psychedelic research. We will require it to meet the same standards that we apply to big pharma to make any drug into a medicine. And when DEA and the Drug Czar's office and NIDA heard that, they were like, okay, great. These are small nonprofits or small for-profit companies focusing on psychedelics. They'll never get there. It's going to be too complicated for them to do anything. And so everybody signed off. And the official policy at FDA since 1992 has been to open the door to psychedelic research. And as I said, the breakthrough therapy designation is proof that they have stuck by that. So there was this move to Ibogaine-related preclinical animal research. And at the same time, 93, FDA approved some safety studies with Ibogaine in humans, led by Zeno Sanchez-Ramos and Deborah Mash. And this was very hopeful. Out of this research, Deborah Mash identified noribogaine as a long-lasting metabolite, which she hypothesized reduced cravings. She patented it. And unfortunately, and I'm not sure how much of this was discussed at the conference so far, this led to quite a lot of lawsuits between MASH and NDA International Lotsof. So I felt here that the for-profit model unfortunately motivated people to focus more on profits than on healing, than on science, than on who's going to get the private gains from Ibogaine. And so with MAPS doing the nonprofit model and sharing all of our information and having no private gains, we've had a lot more cooperation among research teams all over the world. And so I think this was a sad state of affairs, these lawsuits, and then it really marginalized the whole area of scientific research with Ibogaine. And fortunately now, I think fortunately, the patents have expired. So now, in 1995, Ibogaine preclinical research had reached a point where a decision needed to be made about would human studies take place. And so there was an Ibogaine protocol development meeting taking place March 8th, 1995. And the purpose of this meeting was for NIDA and the Medications Development Division to review the animal research and decide whether to move forward into funding human studies. But unfortunately, and I was at this meeting and attending this meeting, the result of this meeting was that they focused on these Olney's lesions, which is a concern about a potential form of brain damage. And the evidence for this, I think, was vastly overinterpreted in terms of risk. And it was really just an excuse on the part of NIDA not to fund research with Ibogaine in humans. Subsequent research has demonstrated that these Olney's lesions are not a significant problem for people that take MDMA. There's no significant functional consequences from it. But I think the more important thing to say is that every drug has risks, and untreated opiate addiction, untreated addiction is often fatal and carries enormous risks. So even if these Olney's lesions were an issue, were a significant issue, it would not, I think, in a rational risk-benefit calculation, result in any kind of a decision not to move forward with Ibogaine. But this was really overhyped, and it was really a fig leaf, a convenient excuse for NIDA at a time when there still was a lot of cultural resistance to research with psychedelics, that there would be no government funding for research with Ibogaine. And so this was an extremely disappointing outcome for this meeting, but it was not unexpected. And so NIDA found this fig leaf. And at the same time, this was during this time where NIDA was vastly exaggerating the risks of MDMA neurotoxicity, to the point where they were putting out ideas that it was one dose of MDMA causing serious neurotoxicity with substantial functional consequences, so that some of the leading NIDA researchers were saying that MDMA should never be given to humans, not even once, not even in a scientific context, because we already knew it was so dangerous, that and too dangerous at a time when ecstasy was sort of rising in popularity as a recreational drug. But we had evidence at this point in 2 decades, since the middle 70s, when MDMA began to be used as a therapeutic adjunct, that people were fine and people benefited from it greatly. So unfortunately, this NIDA medications development meeting took place at a time where NIDA was vastly exaggerating neurotoxic risks from MDMA, from Ibogaine, and from other substances as well. So since that point in 1995, over 2 decades ago, NIDA has not been open to funding any human studies with Ibogaine. And NIDA is proud to say that they fund roughly 85% of the drug abuse research in the world. So without NIDA funding, it's very unlikely, and sadly, we found that to be the case, that there has not been government funding for this sort of research. And so this was an example of politics, not science. These exaggerated safety concerns were not scientifically based. The 1995 meeting was not fundamentally a scientific meeting, it was a political meeting. And the drug war politics stigmatized the potential uses of psychedelic substance for beneficial uses, maintaining that they have, quote, no currently accepted medical use and no accepted safety for use under medical supervision. And the other aspect of being in Schedule 1 is that they have widespread drug abuse, which is not the case for Ibogaine. So Ibogaine really doesn't fit in the Schedule 1. It should be removed, but that, similar to Copernicus and Galileo being suppressed by the church for scientific understandings about how the universe works, we have had that with Ibogaine. The difference with MDMA and psilocybin is that we've been able to liberate private funds for the development. Now, this is sort of adding insult to injury. 18-MC is a non-psychedelic molecule similar to Ibogaine. It's considered the non-psychedelic Ibogaine. In LSD, there's a drug called bromo-LSD, which is a non-psychedelic version of LSD. And we're understanding that bromo-LSD is having major potential for the treatment of cluster headaches. So there are values. It's important to sort of take the psychedelic properties out of psychedelic molecules and see what kind of things they can do. But in the ultimate frustrating situation, in 2002, Savant, which is a for-profit company, received a $6.5 million 3-year grant from NIDA to develop preclinical data with 18-MC, with the potential, they said, for up to $40 million in additional NIDA funding. And this was to evaluate 18-MC for the treatment of addiction. And at the time, Savant was expected to begin human clinical safety studies of 18-MC in Brazil in 2013 and to begin clinical development in the US in 2014. And I spoke with the president of Savant, and what he told me was that this was the best kind of funding because it was called non-dilutive funding, which means that NIDA gave a for-profit company a grant of $6.5 million and did not ask for any stock in the company. Non-dilutive financing. So all the investors just get this bonus from NIDA. And this was NIDA trying to show that it was doing something for the treatment of addiction with an Ibogaine-like molecule, but eliminating what NIDA considered to be the unwelcome psychedelic properties of Ibogaine. So if there was $6.5 million given to Ibogaine research, we would have an enormous head start, and I think it would develop results that would prime the pump for further investments or further donations. But what's even more frustrating is that Savant has not done a single thing with 18-MC for the treatment of addiction. So I just went the other day to clinicaltrials.gov and did a search on 18-MC. And what I discovered is that they're looking at it for something entirely different, which is for a certain kind of parasite. Somehow or other, this 18-MC may have some efficacy in treating this parasite, which causes leishmaniasis. And we noticed that the sponsor last verified this August 2017, just last month, and the study is not yet open, but there's no effort whatsoever to look at 18-MC for the treatment of addiction. So NIDA gave $6.5 million to try to show it was do something related to Ibogaine to a for-profit company. And all of that from the mission of NIDA has been wasted money. instead of just giving it to Ibogaine research. So that's the kind of tragic situation that we face right now. The only thing that's been possible, and you've heard about this at the conference, has been observational studies looking at clinics where people are going to get Ibogaine, and MAPS has sponsored 2 of these studies, which were just published in the American Journal of Alcohol and Drug Abuse. And these were done with clinics in Mexico and New Zealand. The New Zealand study with Jeff Knoller, who's also at the conference, said the conclusion was, so basically we do baseline measures, and then we do measures once a month for a year to try to see how people are doing in terms of their addiction. And we showed here in New Zealand, consistent with preceding studies, evidence showed significant attenuation of withdrawal, sustained reduction in drug craving and use, and cessation of use in some cases. These outcomes, particularly the sustained reduction and or cessation of opioid use reported by 12 of 14 participants, are comparable with the success of currently accepted treatments. And if this were combined in a therapeutic process, I think it would fundamentally exceed the success of currently available treatments. And in Mexico, with Tom Brown and Ken Elper, who were there as well, their conclusion was, within the limitations of an uncontrolled observational study, Ibogaine appeared to have a substantial substantive treatment effect in opioid detoxification, and group statistics and individual trajectories appear to indicate an effect of reducing drug use at 1 month, which was sustained up to 12 months in a subgroup of subjects. So these are published now, American Journal of Drug and Alcohol Abuse, peer-reviewed journals, and we were hoping that this research would motivate scientists and funders to move into controlled studies with Ibogaine. One of the participants, I have my life back, my personality is back, I want to be more social again. Ibogaine treatment is like having your life handed back to you. And I'm sure you've heard this, hundreds and thousands of times. And I think before we go to questions, what I want to show you here is why, from a political point of view, I think it's fundamentally important that Ibogaine research be initiated, especially in the United States. And so what we see is, if you can look here, is that this is the change in mortality rates in people ages 45 to 54 by race. So what we're seeing is, over the last 15 years, African Americans have been getting healthier. There's a massive decline in mortality rates. In Hispanic populations, there's been a substantial, not massive, but substantial decline in mortality rates. But the only areas where mortality rates have been going up is in whites. And so when you disaggregate by education level, we see that it's mortality rates are going down in people, whites with some college, going way down in people with college or more, but non-college educated middle-aged whites have seen an enormous increase in mortality. And the statisticians who have looked at this, and this was reported in the Washington Post, quote, "What is going on then with death rates for middle-aged whites? Case and Deaton aren't sure, but they argued that alcohol abuse, suicides, and the opioid epidemic have something to do with it. The rate of fatal poisonings, for instance, a category that includes drug overdoses, more than tripled among middle-aged whites since 2000. And so this is called despair deaths. And so the reason I think this is so important is that these people who are suffering this group of people who are suffering despair deaths, there's been other studies that have shown, and this is what this article is pointing out, that these are the people who tend to vote for Trump, that their fear, their desperation has been manipulated by politicians in terms of anger outward to others. And so for those without a college degree, the economy in recent decades has been increasingly miserable. This may explain why some have turned to self-destructive behaviors such as drug and alcohol abuse. And this is a correlation study that looked at the relationship between counties where there were despair deaths and votes for Trump. And so I think there is a strong correlation here. And what this means is that if we could legitimize Ibogaine and use Ibogaine to facilitate treatment for addiction, that on the one hand, we'd be able to really make a lot of progress in terms of treating addiction. But I think with the spiritual properties of Ibogaine, we'd be able to really help people who formerly were suffering from despair and were reaching for fear-based, anger-based, hatred-based of other solutions to their problems, and would help them spiritualize them. And I think this would address a substantial problem we have in America with the support for Trump and the negative outcomes that's coming from the Trump presidency. So I think from many different points of view, it's very important that Ibogaine enter clinical research and be evaluated, and eventually I think it could be approved by regulatory agencies as a treatment. So there is bipartisan support for Ibogaine, and I think we can develop that and move forward with a political movement that I hope that your conference will catalyze. And so with that as an overview, I think I'd like to open it up for questions and basically just say that I very much appreciate what you're doing at the conference. And I'm not aware now of any effort to develop Ibogaine in either a for-profit or a non-profit context through regulatory agencies. And maybe some of the discussions that you've had at the conference have brought forth contrary evidence. Maybe there are efforts to move Ibogaine through the regulatory agencies, or maybe what you're doing will help motivate donors or investors. So I'd be interested in learning about that from you all as well. But I think there can be bipartisan support for Ibogaine. And on top of that, I think it's absolutely essential, both for the treatment of addiction and also for political reasons, that we move forward with Ibogaine.